A man who hadn't spoken another person's name in 3 years. A woman who buried her husband in frozen ground and kept walking anyway. Two children who learned that strangers could become something worse than enemies, or something rarer than gold. When Caleb Thornton answered that marriage broker's advertisement, he told himself it was practical, just business, just survival. But the moment Evelyn Carter stepped off that wagon with mud on her boots and fire in her eyes, something cracked open in his chest that no Montana winter had ever touched. He had no idea what was coming. Neither did she. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning Caleb Thornton finally broke was not a dramatic morning. There was no storm rolling in from the Rockies, no sign painted across the sky. It was just an ordinary Tuesday in late October, the kind of day Montana throws at you like a flat gray stone, cold without being dramatic about it, empty without apologizing for the fact. He'd woken at 4:30 as always, pulled on his boots in the dark as always, stepped outside and stood on the frostbitten porch, looking out at 700 acres of land that belonged to him and nobody else. And that was the problem. He stood there for a long time, longer than usual. The silence pressed against his ears the way deep water presses against your skull. Not violent, just relentless. A coyote called somewhere in the dark hills to the north and then went quiet, and after that there was nothing. Just the creak of the porch boards cooling in the cold, and the distant sound of his horses shifting in the barn, and the enormous, indifferent presence of the land stretching away in every direction without a single human soul anywhere in it. Caleb was 38 years old. He'd spent 19 of those years on this ranch. He knew every fence post by feel, could predict weather by the way the grass moved, had once tracked a wounded cow for 11 miles through snow and brought her back alive on pure stubbornness. He was not a man who scared easily, not a man who complained, not a man who admitted when something hurt. He went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table. The coffee was ready. He'd made it the night before, as he always did, so he wouldn't have to wait in the cold. He poured himself a cup and sat and looked at the opposite chair. The empty one. The one that had been empty for so long that the wood had stopped even accumulating dust in the way a used chair does, and had started to look almost like furniture that had never been sat in at all. He drank his coffee. He did not cry. He was not that kind of man, or at least he had spent years not being that kind of man. But something in him that morning was different. Some wall he'd maintained for a very long time had developed a crack that he could feel even if he couldn't see it. He reached across the table and pulled the newspaper toward him. It was 3 weeks old. The supply wagon only came through every few weeks, and the paper always arrived creased and slightly damp, the ink smudged in ways that made certain letters disappear. He'd already read it twice. He opened it anyway. The advertisement was on page 7, in the classified section, between a notice about a lost mule and a listing for second-hand plow equipment. He'd read it both times before without registering it fully. Now he read it slowly. Marriage Broker Services, Helena Office. Reputable widows and unmarried women of good character seeking frontier husbands. Correspondence welcomed, discretion guaranteed. Caleb sat with that for a while. He turned the cup in his hands, feeling the warmth of it. Outside, the horses were getting louder. They wanted feeding. He'd be up in 10 minutes, back in the routine, and then the day would carry him along the way. Days always carried him, through the doing of things, the checking of fences, the hauling of water, the repair of whatever had broken this week. But he kept looking at the advertisement. He was not a romantic man. He'd been clear-eyed his whole life about the difference between what he wanted and what was real. What was real was that a ranch of this size needed more than one pair of hands. What was real was that he was getting older and the winters were getting longer. What was real was that he'd had a neighbor, old Garrett Bowman, 2 miles east, who died alone in his cabin the previous February and hadn't been found for 11 days. Caleb told himself that's what he was thinking about. Practicality. Partnership. The sensible economics of frontier survival. He tore the advertisement out of the paper, folded it twice, and put it in his shirt pocket. What? He did not write the letter that day. He wrote it 4 days later, sitting at the same table in the same chair, by the light of a kerosene lamp that was running low on fuel. He wrote it in pencil because his pen had dried out, and he hadn't thought to order a new one. He wrote it 3 times, tearing up the first 2. The third version was short and not particularly eloquent. He said he was a rancher, that he owned his land clear, that he was a hard worker and a sober man, and that he was looking for a practical arrangement with a woman who understood frontier life wasn't comfortable but could be decent. He did not write anything about loneliness. He was proud enough, or cautious enough, that he left that part out entirely. He sent it with the next supply wagon and then put it out of his mind as best he could, or tried to. The response came 6 weeks later. It was not from the marriage broker's office. It was a personal letter written in a hand that was neat and slightly cramped, like someone who'd learned to write economically because paper was always scarce. Dear Mr. Thornton, my name is Evelyn Carter. I am 34 years old and a widow. My husband, James Carter, died of fever 18 months ago, leaving me with 2 children, Noah, who is 11, and Lucy, who is 7. We are currently in St. Louis, where I have been working as a seamstress, but I will be honest with you, St. Louis is not working for us. It is too expensive, the work is unreliable, and I have come to believe that the city holds nothing for us except more of the same difficulty. I am writing directly rather than through the broker's office because I find that kind of intermediary tends to produce a lot of flattering descriptions that don't hold up under scrutiny, and I suspect you'd rather know what you're actually getting. What you're getting, if this arrangement proceeds, is a woman who can work hard, who is not afraid of weather, who can cook and sew and help run a household, and who has 2 children who are well-behaved but who are real children and will sometimes be loud and difficult as real children are. I have one condition that I will state plainly. My children come with me. If you want a wife, you take a family. I will not negotiate on this point. I would like to know more about your land and your situation. If you're willing, write back. Respectfully, Evelyn Carter. Caleb read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning dark. Then he read it a third time. Something about the straightforwardness of it startled him, in the way that unexpectedly cold water startles you. Not unpleasant, just sudden. He'd half expected something careful and optimistic and designed to sell itself to him. This letter was none of those things. This woman had listed her liabilities right up front, which was either honest or foolish, and he found himself suspecting it was honest. He wrote back that same evening. He told her about the land, the 700 acres, the 200 head of cattle currently, the spring that never ran dry, the fact that the winters were genuinely brutal and the summers short and unpredictable. He described the cabin as it actually was. 2 rooms, a loft, a stone fireplace that drew well, and a wood stove that had a temperamental damper. He told her the nearest town was Ridgeback, 11 miles east, and that there was a school there, though the road became impassable for stretches in February. He wrote, "Your condition is fair. A family is more than I have now, and more than I expected. I accept." He read that last sentence 4 times before he left it in. Then he folded the letter and set it with the outgoing mail and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours before sleeping. The correspondence that followed over the next 2 months was not romantic. They were both too practical for that, and there was too much real information to exchange. She asked about water quality, and he told her about the spring and the well. He asked about the children's health, and she told him Noah had broken his arm the previous year, but it had healed clean, and Lucy was small for her age but strong. She told him what they were bringing, 2 trunks, some cookware, a sewing kit, and the children's few possessions. He told her about the livestock, the soil, the nearest doctor, the church in Ridgeback that he himself never attended, but that she might want to know about. There was one letter, near the end of October, that came closer to personal than the others. She'd written it in what he imagined must have been late evening, because the handwriting was slightly less careful, and she'd said, "I want to be honest with you about something. I am not doing this because I am optimistic about life. I am doing this because my children deserve a chance at something stable, and I cannot give them that alone. I'm not bringing you my best self right now. I am bringing you someone who is very tired and doing her best and trying to keep it together for 2 kids who already lost their father. I think you should know that going in." He'd sat with that for a long time. He wrote back, "I'm not doing this because I'm optimistic either. I think we understand each other fine." He meant it as reassurance. He hoped it came across that way. They arrived on a Thursday, in the first week of December. Caleb had driven the wagon to Ridgeback to meet the stage, and he'd waited outside the depot in the cold for an hour before it arrived, because it was late, and the road from Billings had apparently been rough. He'd worn his better coat and cleaned his boots that morning, both of which he immediately felt self-conscious about. He stood by the wagon with his hands in his pockets and watched the stage pull in. There were 6 passengers, 2 minors, judging by the look of them, an older couple, husband and wife, who seemed exhausted from travel, a young man in a too-thin jacket who looked like he was running from something, and a woman with 2 children. He knew her immediately, which surprised him, because he had no way of knowing what she looked like. But she came off the stage with a child's hand in each of hers, and she was looking at the town with clear, assessing eyes. Not with wonder, not with fear, just with the look of someone cataloging what they were dealing with. And he knew. She was shorter than he'd expected, dark hair, mostly pinned up, with strands coming loose from what must have been a long journey. Her coat was wool and decent quality, but worn at the elbows. She had a scar near her chin, small, pale, old. Her face was not soft. It was a face that had been through things, that had decided to keep going through them without complaint. And the years of that had given it a quality that was less about beauty and more about something harder to name. She spotted him about the same time he'd been staring at her for 10 seconds too long, and she walked toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Thornton," she said. Not a question. "Mrs. Carter." He took his hat off, which felt both correct and awkward. "Good journey?" "No," she said, "but we made it." He looked at the children. The boy, Noah, was watching him with the specific wariness of a child who has learned that new adults require careful observation before trust. He was tall for 11, with his mother's dark coloring and a jaw set in a way that suggested he'd already had to be older than he should. The girl, Lucy, was tucked slightly behind her mother, gripping her coat hem, examining Caleb with enormous brown eyes that seemed to be conducting a thorough independent analysis. "Hi," Caleb said to both of them. It came out flat and inadequate, which was because he hadn't spoken to children in approximately 7 years and had no idea how it was supposed to sound. Noah gave a single nod, the kind of nod a much older person might give. Lucy stared at him for a moment longer, then looked at his wagon. "Is that your horse?" she asked. "That's Duchess." "Yes." "She's dirty." "Lucy," Evelyn started. "She had a hard week," Caleb said. Lucy considered this. "So did we," she said, with a gravity that landed somewhere between funny and heartbreaking, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest, very slightly, in a place he hadn't expected. "Fair enough," he said. "Just so." The drive out to the ranch took 2 hours. The road was rough, the cold had teeth, and they sat in the wagon with blankets over their laps and mostly didn't talk. The children fell asleep against their mother within 30 minutes, Lucy tucked under Evelyn's arm. Noah sitting upright, but with his eyes closed in the unconscious way of the deeply exhausted. Evelyn stayed awake. She looked at the land as they moved through it. "It goes on a long time," she said at one point. "Yes," he said. "Is it always this quiet?" She glanced at him. "I was going to say empty." "Yes," he said again, "but you get used to it." She was quiet for a moment, watching the planes roll by in the gray afternoon light. Then, "I grew up in Ohio. There were always people around, neighbors, noise." She paused. "James and I lived in St. Louis for 6 years after we married. City life." He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure she was really talking to him so much as thinking out loud. "I don't know if I'll get used to it," she said. "I'm trying to tell myself that honestly rather than pretend I'm sure of something I'm not." He appreciated that more than he knew how to say. He shifted the reins to one hand. "The first winter is the hardest," he offered. "After that, you stop fighting it and start just working with it." She looked at him. "And if you can't stop fighting it, then it's a hard life," he said, and meant it plainly, without cruelty. "I won't lie to you about that." She seemed to find that answer acceptable. She looked back at the land. "I can work hard," she said. "Not defensive, just factual." "I believe you. I'm not here to be taken care of. I want that clear between us." "I didn't ask for someone to take care of," he said. "I asked for a partner." She turned to look at him again, and he felt the weight of her assessment like a hand testing ice before stepping out. He kept his eyes on the road. "All right," she said finally, and looked forward. They didn't talk again until the ranch came into view. He tried to prepare the cabin. He wasn't entirely sure what preparing it meant. He'd cleaned it, which for him meant sweeping the floors and scrubbing the table and making sure there weren't mouse droppings in the corners he'd missed. He'd put fresh straw in the loft, which he'd assigned to the children. He'd moved his own things to make room on the shelves for whatever they'd brought. He'd laid a fire ready to light. It was still a very small cabin. He watched Evelyn's face as they came through the door. She took it in without expression. The single main room with its fireplace and wood stove and the table and 2 chairs he'd owned for 12 years. The rough plank shelves. The one window with its oiled paper pane. The loft ladder in the corner. He'd known she'd see it for what it was, and she did. "The loft is for the children," he said. "Warmer up there anyway. Heat rises. I'll sleep down here." "What about me?" she asked. He'd thought about this more than he wanted to admit. "The bed's in the corner. I put a curtain up." There was a blanket hung from a rope strung across one corner of the room, creating a rough privacy screen. "It's not," he started. "It's fine," she said. Her voice was even. She was looking at the curtain arrangement, and he couldn't tell what she was thinking, and he was aware that what he'd rigged up was a kind of statement about the nature of their situation that neither of them had entirely articulated yet. That this was a practical arrangement between 2 grown strangers who were still figuring out what they were to each other. She turned to the children who had come in behind her. "Noah, take the bags up to the loft. Lucy, stay close to me." "It smells like horses," Lucy said. "There's a barn 40 feet away," Caleb said. "Oh." She seemed to find this satisfying as an explanation. He lit the fire. Evelyn, without asking where anything was, found the kitchen supplies and started looking through what he had. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. The efficient way she moved, checking the flour barrel and the salt and the dried beans, not fussing over the inadequacy of any of it, just cataloging. "What do you usually eat for supper?" she asked. "Whatever's quick. I'll make something hot. We haven't had a proper meal since Billings." She paused, holding a dried strip of venison. "Is this yours?" "From last November. Elk, actually." She nodded. "Good. I can work with this." He stood in the middle of his own cabin and felt slightly useless, which was not a sensation he was accustomed to. "I should check on the horses," he said. "Go ahead." He went. Outside in the cold, he stood by Duchess's stall and let himself breathe for a minute. The mare nuzzled his hand looking for sugar that he didn't have. He rubbed her nose and looked back at the warm orange glow from the cabin window, where he could see the shape of Evelyn moving around the room, and Noah coming down from the loft, and Lucy standing on a chair to look out the window. He stayed in the barn longer than he needed to. When he came back in, there was food on the table. Not fancy, a thick soup made from the elk jerky and dried vegetables, cornbread that she'd somehow produced from his dwindling supplies in 40 minutes, a pot of something hot to drink that was not coffee but smelled like dried herbs. The children were already seated. Noah was sitting straight, like he'd been taught. Lucy was swinging her feet because her legs didn't reach the floor. Evelyn was ladling soup into bowls, her back to the door when he came in, and she said without turning, "Wash your hands." He stopped, blinked. "There's a basin by the stove," she added. He washed his hands. He sat down. He looked at the table, at the 4 bowls, at the children, and at this woman who had, in 40 minutes, turned his kitchen into something it had not been in a very long time. "Thank you," he said. "This is—" He paused, fumbling for something that didn't sound stupid. "It's just food," she said, sitting down across from him. "We all need it." Noah was watching Caleb over the rim of his bowl with that same careful assessment. Caleb met his eyes and didn't look away, which he figured was important. He didn't look away from eyes that were testing him. He just looked back, steady. After a moment, Noah looked down at his soup. Small thing. Caleb filed it away. He had planned a simple ceremony, a practical one. The Justice of the Peace in Ridgeback was a man named Aldred Hutchins, who conducted marriages the way he conducted everything, quickly and without sentiment. Caleb had arranged it before they arrived. They drove to Ridgeback 2 days later. The children came. There was no decorating, no flowers. December wasn't the season for them out here. No guests. Evelyn wore her better dress, which was brown wool and modest and suited her. Caleb wore his clean shirt. Aldred Hutchins read the words in about 4 minutes, including the part where he paused to clear his throat. Evelyn said her vows looking directly at Caleb, her voice steady and clear, Not the way someone recites something they feel, but the way someone makes a decision they intend to keep. Caleb said his the same way. At the end, Hutchins said, "You may kiss your bride," in the tone of a man who found the whole custom slightly inefficient. There was a pause. Caleb and Evelyn looked at each other. He leaned forward and kissed her once, briefly, on the cheek, and she let him, and neither of them was exactly sure what to do with their faces afterward, so they both looked at something else. Lucy, who had been watching this exchange with the analytical interest of a naturalist observing an unfamiliar species, announced, "That was a weird kiss." "Lucy," Noah muttered. "It was." "It was fine," Evelyn said, in a tone that ended the discussion. On the way home in the wagon, the sky had turned the color it gets in Montana in December, that particular shade of iron gray that sits low and heavy and means business. Caleb watched it and recalculated his firewood situation and thought about whether the north fence needed attention before the first real snow. In the back of the wagon, Lucy had fallen asleep against Noah's arm. Noah was looking out at the land, his expression unreadable. After a while, without looking at Caleb, he said, "That's your ranch out there?" "Yes." "All of it?" "Far as you can see. A little further east." A pause. "What do you run?" "Cattle mostly, some horses, a kitchen garden in summer." Noah was quiet. Then, "My dad ran a dry goods store," he said, not said with grief exactly, more with the simple, practical acknowledgement of a fact about someone who used to exist. He didn't know anything about cattle. "That's all right," Caleb said. "Neither did I at first." Noah glanced at him for the first time. "Quick. Who taught you?" "A man named Felix Harker, old rancher. He's gone now, but I worked for him for 4 years before I had my own land." Noah looked forward again. "Could you teach me?" he asked. Caleb hadn't expected the question. He considered it for a moment. Not the yes or no of it, but the weight of it. What the boy was asking was something larger than ranching. "Yeah," he said. "I can teach you." Noah nodded, didn't say anything else, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, very slightly, just a fraction of the tension he'd been carrying since the moment Caleb first saw him coming off that stage. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. The first weeks were rough in ways that didn't announce themselves dramatically. There was no single terrible day. There was just the accumulation of small difficulties. The constant negotiation of 4 people in a small space, the learning of new rhythms, the specific friction of strangers becoming something else without any clear instruction on how to do it. Caleb was not good at the domestic adjustments. He'd lived alone for years and had developed habits that were efficient for a single man and frankly strange in the context of a family. He ate at irregular hours, talked to his horses more than people, had no patience for conversation in the first 2 hours of the morning, and had a system for organizing his tools that made complete sense to him and was apparently incomprehensible to everyone else. He found Evelyn reorganizing his tool shed on a Sunday morning and had to leave before he said something wrong, standing outside in the cold, reminding himself that this was her home now and she was allowed to put things where she needed them, and that her system probably made as much sense as his did, even if it didn't feel that way. She came and found him afterward, which he hadn't expected. "I should have asked before I changed anything," she said. No preamble, no building up to it, just straight. He was caught off guard by the directness. "I should have said something instead of walking off." She looked at him. "I grew up watching my mother tiptoe around my father's moods, and I decided a long time ago I didn't want to live that way. So if I do something that bothers you, tell me." "Same to you," he said. A pause, something slightly uncomfortable, not quite resolved, but acknowledged. "Your tool system," she said carefully, "is genuinely confusing." "Your filing system," he said, "is something I will probably never understand." Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was related to one. "Fair enough," she said, and went back inside. The hardest part was the children. Not because they were bad children. They weren't. But Caleb had no experience with children, which meant he was always slightly off. Too formal when he should have been easy, too blunt when he should have been gentle, absent when he should have been present. He didn't know how to be in a room with a 7-year-old, which turned out to be a specific skill nobody taught you. Lucy was the harder puzzle. Noah he could manage. The boy responded to respect and clear expectations and being given real work to do, and those were things Caleb understood. But Lucy was 7 and full of enormous emotions that arrived without warning and logic seemed to have no jurisdiction over. The first time she cried at supper, he froze completely. She was crying over something small. She'd spilled her milk and was upset about it, and the crying was that kind of 7-year-old crying that starts about one thing and rapidly becomes about everything. And he sat across from her with his fork halfway to his mouth and absolutely no idea what the correct action was. Evelyn was moving to get a cloth. Noah was carefully looking at his plate, and Lucy was crying. He put his fork down. He leaned forward slightly. He said, "Hey." She looked up at him, mid-cry, startled by the directness. "Spilled milk's not the end of the world," he said. He tried to keep his voice even and not stupid about it. "I spilled something every day when I was your age. Still do sometimes." She stared at him. Her crying slowed to hiccups. "You do?" "Just last week I dropped an entire bucket of water on myself in the barn. That landed wrong, or right," and she let out a wet, surprised laugh that was mostly still a cry. "That's so dumb," she said. "Yeah," he agreed. He felt Evelyn's eyes on him from across the room. He didn't look at her. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't a movie moment. He still didn't know what he was doing with children, and she was still crying 30 seconds after she laughed. But it was something. The formal moment came on a Sunday, 3 weeks after they'd arrived. He had not planned it. He had not prepared a speech. They'd spent the morning doing various chores, and in the afternoon he'd been working on a section of the north fence that had started to lean, and Noah had come out without being asked, and started handing him tools and holding boards while he worked, and they'd done 2 hours of good quiet work together in the winter cold. When they got back to the cabin, Evelyn had hot coffee ready, and Lucy was at the table drawing something on a piece of paper with one of her few pencils. He was warming his hands by the fire when Lucy held up her drawing. "I made a picture of everyone," she announced. He looked at it. She'd drawn 4 figures, stick people, more or less, the way children draw, lined up in front of a small rectangle that was presumably the cabin. She'd labeled each one, Mama, Noah, me, and the 4th one, slightly taller and positioned at the end, was labeled Caleb. Not Mr. Thornton, not the man. Caleb. She looked at him with her enormous analytical eyes. "Is that okay?" she asked. "That I wrote your name?" He looked at the drawing, at the small stick figure with his name under it, standing with her small stick family. Something moved in him, deep and slow, like water under ice. "Yeah," he said. His voice came out rougher than intended. "That's okay." He looked up and found Evelyn watching him from the other side of the room, and for just a moment they looked at each other with the particular expression of 2 people who are not yet sure what they are to each other, but who are beginning to understand that something real is happening, whether they plan for it or not. The moment passed. He looked back at the fire. She looked back at the stove. But the picture stayed on the table for the rest of the evening, and when he moved it aside to set supper dishes, he put it on the shelf instead of the floor. He didn't explain why. He wasn't sure he had to. But Montana winter settled over the ranch like something deliberate. The temperatures dropped until the air had teeth, until breath came out in clouds that hung for a moment and then dissipated, until the horses stood in their stalls with their breath steaming and the water in the troughs needed breaking every morning. The world went white and silent and vast, and the small warm square of light from the cabin window at night looked very small against it. Inside, 4 people negotiated the space between strangers and something else. They were not a family yet, not by a long stretch, but they were sharing a table and a fire and work and the specific intimacy of 4 people weathering something difficult together, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot, more than Caleb had had in years. He still lay awake some nights listening to the wind, which he'd always done, but now there was something else in the sound of the cabin at night. The specific quiet breathing of sleep, the occasional small noise of a child turning over in the loft, the way the wood stove ticked as it cooled. Sounds that meant something lived here, sounds that meant he was not alone. He lay in the dark on his pallet by the fire and listened to those sounds, and some part of him that had been held tight for a very long time began, very slowly, to do something it hadn't done in years. To rest. The picture stayed on the shelf all through December. Caleb noticed it every morning when he reached for his coffee cup. Lucy's 4 stick figures lined up in front of the cabin, crayon smudged at the edges where she'd pressed too hard. He never moved it. He wasn't sure why he kept noticing it, only that he did. January arrived the way Montana Januaries always did, without ceremony and without mercy. The temperature dropped another 15 degrees and stayed there, and the snow that had been falling in polite dustings through December became something serious. The road to Ridgeback disappeared under 2 feet of it by the second week, and then it didn't matter because the cold made the horses reluctant anyway, and the family settled into the specific closeness of people who are snowed in together with no choice about it. The cabin was small. Caleb had always known it was small. He'd built it himself, had made every decision about its dimensions, and had found those dimensions perfectly adequate for one man. For 4 people in deep winter, small was the kind of problem you couldn't reason your way around. You simply had to live inside it and manage. Managing meant negotiating. Where things were stored, when the fire got banked, who needed quiet, and when. These were not conversations they had cleanly. They happened sideways, through small frictions that revealed themselves gradually, the way wood rot does, hidden until you press and feel the give. Evelyn was an early riser, which was fine. She was also quietly relentless about keeping the space organized, which Caleb respected intellectually but found maddening in practice when he came in from the cold at odd hours and couldn't locate something he was certain he'd left in a particular spot. He said nothing about this for 2 weeks. Then one evening, he opened 3 wrong drawers looking for the spare lashing cord and shut the last one with a little more force than intended. Evelyn, stirring something at the stove, said without turning, "Bottom left of the supply box." "I know where things are," he said, which was a lie, and they both knew it. "Bottom left of the supply box," she said again, in the exact same tone. He found it there. He didn't say anything, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She didn't say anything either, which he was beginning to understand was her version of grace. They were not easy together. Not yet, maybe not for a long time. But they were developing a kind of working language, the way 2 people who have to function in a small space develop one by necessity. It was not affection. It was not romance. It was something quieter and in its own way harder, the steady daily business of choosing to make something work. Noah threw himself into ranch work with a focus that surprised Caleb, and then after a while didn't surprise him at all. The boy was hungry for it, for the realness of it maybe, for the way it had clear rules and clear results. You fixed a fence, and the fence was fixed. You fed the cattle, and the cattle were fed. There was a satisfaction in that kind of work that Caleb had always understood, and watching Noah discover it was strange and unexpectedly moving. He was a quick learner, quicker than Caleb had been, though he'd never have said so out loud. He watched once and then did. When he made mistakes, and he made them, the regular instructive mistakes of someone learning something real, he went quiet and worked out what he'd done wrong, rather than asking to be told. Once, in the 3rd week of January, he'd rigged a pulley system wrong, and a section of roof planking he'd been trying to lift had come down badly, scattering wood across the snow, missing Caleb by about 3 feet. Caleb had stood there for a moment in the white cold, looking at the scattered wood. Then he looked at Noah, who had gone very still with the specific stillness of a child bracing for anger. "You pulled from the wrong angle," Caleb said. "The weight shifted." Noah said nothing. His jaw was tight. "Come here." Caleb walked him through the rigging again, slowly, showing him where the load needed to be balanced. His hands were cold, and he was not a patient explainer by nature, but he kept his voice level. "Try it." Noah tried it. The plank lifted clean. "Okay," Noah said quietly. "Yeah." Caleb stepped back. "You'll get it." He'd started to walk away when Noah said, behind him, "I thought you'd be mad." Caleb stopped, turned halfway. "Would Matt have fixed the rigging?" A pause. "No." Then what would be the point? He went back to work. But he was aware that Noah was watching him differently after that, and he understood what the boy was measuring him against, even if neither of them would ever say it plainly. Lucy was another matter entirely. With Lucy, nothing was systematic. She was a small, unpredictable force, curious and loud and tender in alternating waves that seemed to have no pattern. She asked questions constantly, the kind of questions that started somewhere reasonable and arrived somewhere completely unexpected. One morning, she watched Caleb oil a saddle for 20 minutes in silence and then said, "Do you miss being lonely?" He stopped oiling. "What?" "Before we came," she said. "Was it quiet?" "Yes." "Do you miss it?" He thought about lying, which would have been easy and probably kind. Then he thought about what kind of answer she actually deserved. "Sometimes," he said, "but quiet and lonely aren't the same thing, and I mixed them up for a long time." She looked at him with those enormous eyes. "What's the difference?" "Quiet is what you choose," he said. "Lonely is what happens when you don't have a choice anymore." She sat with that for a while, turning something over in her small, serious face. Then, "We're noisy." "You are," he agreed. "Does it bother you?" He started oiling the saddle again. "Getting used to it." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went off to do something else that he'd probably have to undo later. He kept working and tried to figure out how a 7-year-old had just made him say something true that he hadn't planned to say. The first real trouble came in late January from Ridgeback. He'd known it was coming, in the abstract way you know weather is coming because you can feel it in the air. The town of Ridgeback was small, 400 people, more or less. And small towns had their own gravitational logic, their own way of processing unusual arrangements. A rancher marrying a widow from St. Louis, arriving with her children, set up in the Carter Ranch on the edge of the valley. That was information the town would turn over and examine and eventually produce a verdict on. The verdict arrived in the form of Mabel Hurst. Mabel Hurst was not a villain. She was simply a woman with strong opinions about the correct way to do things and no particular awareness that her opinions had edges on them. She ran the dry goods store with her husband, she organized the women's social, and she had been the unofficial arbiter of Ridgeback's social landscape for 15 years. When Evelyn came into town with Caleb on a supply run in late January, the first time Evelyn had been to Ridgeback since the wedding, Mabel Hurst was behind the counter. She was pleasant. That was the thing. She smiled and introduced herself and asked after the children, and then she said, in the warm, carrying voice of someone who didn't realize or didn't care who else was listening, "It's very brave of Caleb to take on another man's family, very Christian of him. Some men wouldn't." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. 2 other women in the store were listening with the particular quality of attention that means you've been waiting for exactly this. "He didn't take us on," Evelyn said. Her voice was even. "We're a family. That's how it works." Mabel blinked. "Of course, dear. I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Evelyn put her list on the counter. "We need these supplies, please." The rest of the transaction was civil and slightly frozen. Outside in the wagon, she didn't say anything for a while. Caleb drove and didn't push it. Finally, she said, "How long has this town known you?" 12 years. "And in 12 years, nobody's given you any trouble?" "I kept to myself. People leave you alone if you don't give them anything to talk about." She looked at him. "We're something to talk about now?" "Yes," he said. She turned forward again. "Good," she said with a flatness that surprised him. "I'd rather they said it to my face than behind my back." He glanced at her. She was looking at the road, jaw set, and there was something in her face that was less upset than resolved, the way a person looks when they've already done the math on a hard situation and decided what they're going to do about it. He found that he respected it enormously, which was its own surprise. The talk in town got louder over the following weeks. He heard fragments of it when he came in for supplies alone. Lowered voices that didn't lower quite enough. The particular quality of silence that falls when you walk into a conversation about yourself. What he gathered, pieced together. Some people thought the marriage was improper, a rushed arrangement, a man of Caleb's standing doing something desperate. Some people thought Evelyn was calculating, a widow who'd found herself a meal ticket, as one person apparently put it, not knowing Caleb was close enough to hear it. He didn't tell Evelyn that part. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because it was the kind of thing you couldn't unhear, and she was already carrying enough. But there was an afternoon about 2 weeks into the worst of it, when Noah came home from a trip to the store with Caleb silent, in a way that was different from his regular quiet. They were halfway home when Caleb looked sideways at him. "What happened?" Noah looked at the road. "Nothing." "Noah." A long pause. The horses moved through the gray afternoon. Finally, Noah said, "There were some boys outside the store. They said things." "What kind of things?" "About Mom." His voice was tight. About the situation. What kind of woman does this? That kind of thing. Caleb kept his hand steady on the reins. Inside him, something had gone very cold and very quiet, the way he got sometimes when something made him genuinely angry. Not the hot kind of angry that makes people shout, but the cold kind that sits in your chest like something deliberate. "How old were these boys?" 14, maybe. There were 3 of them." "What did you do?" Another pause. "Nothing, because you said to keep my head down in town." His voice had something in it, not resentment exactly, but the specific strain of a boy who'd done the right thing and found it didn't feel as clean as he'd expected. "That was the right call," Caleb said. "It didn't feel right." "No," Caleb agreed. "It usually doesn't. Doing the right thing and feeling good about it are different things." Noah was quiet. Then, "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to talk to their fathers." His voice was level. "Like an adult." "And if that doesn't work?" Caleb shifted the reins. "Then I'll talk louder." He did talk to their fathers. 2 of them were decent men who were embarrassed and promised to handle it. The third was less receptive, a man named Corbin, who ran a small cattle operation south of town and had an opinion about Caleb's marriage that he wasn't inclined to keep to himself. The conversation in the street outside Corbin's place was short and did not go entirely calmly, and Caleb came home that evening with the specific look of someone who'd held their temper by the narrowest of margins. Evelyn saw his face when he came in. She put down what she was doing. "What happened?" "Had a conversation in town." "About us?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "Are you all right?" He was slightly surprised by the question. "I'm fine." "You have a look." "What look?" "Like you're working very hard at being calm." She said it without accusation, just observation, like she was naming something she'd already cataloged. He let out a breath. "There are people in that town who have decided what we are, and they're going to hold that opinion regardless." "I know." "It bothers me more than I expected it to." She looked at him steadily. "Because you've been here 12 years and you thought they knew you." The accuracy of it landed somewhere uncomfortable. He looked away. "I knew they talked. I didn't think they'd—" He stopped. "Say it to your children's faces," she finished quietly. "They're not—" He stopped again. In the pause, something shifted. They both felt it. The specific moment when a word you've been careful not to say gets said by implication, and then it's out there and you have to decide what to do with it. "They're not my children," he said carefully. I'm not saying that like it's—" He was fumbling and he knew it, which was not a comfortable experience for a man who rarely fumbled. Evelyn was watching him without judgment. "I know," she said, "but you went and talked to those fathers." He looked at her. "You went and talked to those fathers," she said again more quietly. "You didn't have to do that." He didn't have a response to that. She went back to what she'd been doing, and he stood in the middle of the cabin for a moment, feeling like the ground had moved slightly under him without warning, and then he went to wash up for supper. At the table that night, Lucy climbed onto her chair and looked at Caleb with the directness she aimed at everything. "Are we in trouble with the town?" she asked. "Lucy," Evelyn started. "We heard you and Caleb talking," Noah said. Not apologetic, just honest. Caleb looked at them both. He thought about softening it, then decided against it. "Some people in town think our family is unusual," he said, "and unusual makes people uncomfortable." "Why?" Lucy asked. "Because they don't know what to do with things they don't understand." "But we're just people," she said, with the simple bewilderment of someone encountering adult irrationality for the first time. "Yes," he said. "You'd think that would be enough." She frowned at her plate. Noah was quiet, but listening closely, the way he did when he was filing something away. Evelyn was looking at her hands. "What do we do?" Lucy asked. "We do what we've been doing," Caleb said. "We work hard, we keep our heads up, and we don't let other people's opinion of us change who we are." Lucy seemed to consider this thoroughly. "Mrs. Hurst called Mama a poor dear," she reported. "At the store. She didn't know I was listening." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "How'd it make you feel?" Caleb asked Lucy. Mad, she said simply. Good, he said. Hold on to that. Just don't do anything with it in the store. She nodded like they'd struck an agreement, picked up her fork, and went back to eating with the efficiency of someone who'd settled the matter. He looked up and found Evelyn watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Something complicated and careful, like a door open just a crack. He didn't stare. He looked back at his plate. The weeks ground on. February came and the cold deepened and the family bent under the weight of it and didn't break. They developed rhythms. Noah and Caleb fell into an early morning pattern, up at 4:30, barn first, back in for coffee before the hard work of the day. Caleb started teaching him how to read weather, how to track the movement of the cattle in the snow, how to tell when an animal was sick before it got obvious. Noah absorbed it like ground-absorbing rain after a long drought, completely, hungrily, with a kind of relief. Evelyn and Caleb developed their own odd equilibrium. They were not close, not yet, but they were honest with each other in the particular way of people who are too tired for anything else. She told him when something in the cabin wasn't working, and he fixed it. He told her when the food stores were running low before they became a problem. They talked practically, and sometimes in the evenings, when the children were asleep in the loft, they sat by the fire and said nothing for a stretch of time that gradually became less uncomfortable and more like something else. Like the easy quiet that exists between people who no longer need to fill the silence to prove something. One evening in late February, she was mending Noah's coat by the fire, and he was sharpening a blade, and she said without looking up, "My husband was a good man." He kept working. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't." A pause. "I just think you should know that I'm not— This isn't because what I had before was bad. What I had was good. And it ended, and I kept going, because that's what you do." She ran the needle through the coat. "I didn't want you to think I came here because I gave up on something." He put the blade down. He looked at the fire for a moment. "I didn't think that," he said. "You came here because you're stubborn and practical, and you were trying to give your kids something solid." She glanced at him. "Those are compliments," he said. Something in her face loosened, just slightly. "James would have found this completely insane," she said, "this whole arrangement. But there was a warmth in it, the warmth of someone who can smile at someone they've lost." "My father would have said the same," Caleb said. "He'd have told me I was being an idiot." "Were you?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet." She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, really laugh, not polite, not careful, just real. It was a good laugh, short and genuine, and it surprised them both. The sound of it sat in the room for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing what Montana wind in February does, which was everything. But inside, the fire was going, and the children were asleep upstairs, and two people who had begun as strangers sat across from each other in the firelight, and felt the faint, uncertain warmth of something beginning. Neither of them said anything about it. They went back to what they'd been doing. But the evening felt different from the ones before it, and when Caleb lay down on his pallet later and listened to the wind, the cold feeling that had lived in his chest for so long had contracted slightly, shrunk down from something that filled him to something smaller and less absolute. He didn't name what was taking its place. Not yet. Spring came late that year, and wrong. It arrived not as relief, but as a warning nobody could read clearly enough until the damage was already underway. The snow melted fast in March. Too fast, in a way that stripped the topsoil without soaking it, running off in brown sheets toward the creek rather than sinking down to where the roots needed it. April was dry. May was drier. By the first week of June, Caleb was walking his pastures in the early morning and pressing his boot into ground that should have given softly and finding it packed and pale, the grass thin and yellowing at the edges in a way that made something in his stomach tighten every time he looked at it. He'd seen drought before. Every rancher in Montana had. But there was knowing something could happen, and then there was watching it happen to you. Watching the specific thing you'd built your entire life around start to buckle at the edges. And those were two different experiences entirely. He didn't say anything to Evelyn at first. He told himself he was gathering information, that there was no use alarming anyone before he understood the full picture. But the truth was partly that he still had the habits of a man who'd carried everything alone, and old habits don't surrender without a fight. Evelyn figured it out anyway. She'd been watching him come in from the morning rounds with a different quality of quiet on him, the kind that meant his head was full of something he wasn't saying. She waited until the children were occupied. Noah out in the barn, Lucy bent over her schoolwork at the table, and then she put 2 cups of coffee down and said, "Tell me what's happening with the land." He looked at her. "I'm not made of glass," she said. "Tell me." So he told her. The soil readings, the creek level, the state of the north pasture. The fact that he'd already moved half the cattle to the south field where there was slightly more grass, but that wouldn't hold more than another few weeks. The hay stores, which were lower than they should have been for this point in the season. He laid it out plainly, the way she'd always asked him to, and she listened without interrupting, her hands around her cup. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How bad could it get?" "Depends on July," he said. "If we get rain in July, we're tight but manageable. If July is dry—" He stopped. "It could be very bad." She nodded once. "What do we do right now, today?" That was the thing about her that still caught him off guard sometimes. The way she moved directly from understanding a problem to solving it, without the detour through panic or resentment. "Conserve everything we can," he said. "Water especially. Start rationing the hay. I need to look at the east fence line. If I can open access to the creek bottom, there's still some green down there." "I can do the rationing," she said. "Tell me the amounts." He told her. She didn't write it down. He'd noticed she had a precise memory for practical information, held numbers and quantities without needing paper. She drank her coffee and he drank his, and they sat with the weight of it between them in a way that was, he realized, different from how he would have sat with it alone. Heavier in one sense, but distributed, which made it possible to stand under. It was Noah who first mentioned the name Silas Crow. He'd come back from a solo ride to check the east fence. Caleb had started letting him do the shorter solo runs, which Noah took with a seriousness that was almost solemn, and he came into the barn with a look on his face that Caleb recognized as the look of someone who'd seen something they weren't sure how to report. "There's a section of the east fence down," Noah said, "about 40 yards of it." Caleb looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Wind damage?" "No." Noah paused. "The posts were cut, clean. Someone used a tool on them." The barn went quiet. Caleb set down the harness. "You're sure?" "I know what wind damage looks like," Noah said, with a quiet steadiness that reminded Caleb briefly and painfully of how much the boy had grown in 6 months. This wasn't wind. Caleb went out to look at it himself. Noah was right. 3 posts cut through at the base, the wire coiled back deliberately, the kind of deliberate that only a person makes. He crouched by the cut wood and felt the cold settle into him, not the weather kind. He knew who owned the land on the other side of that fence. Silas Crow had ranched the valley southwest of Caleb's property for 20 years. He was older, close to 60, and had the specific quality of a man who had gotten what he wanted for long enough that he'd stopped being able to imagine not getting it. His operation was larger than Caleb's, and he ran it with a hard efficiency that his hired hands did not seem to enjoy. Twice over the years, he'd made approaches about buying Caleb's land, and twice Caleb had declined, and both times Crow had received the answer with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said something pleasant that didn't mean what it said. Caleb had kept his distance since then, not out of fear. He was not afraid of Silas Crow, but because he understood that some conflicts were better managed by the absence of opportunity, and sharing a fence line with a man who wanted your land meant being careful about what opportunities you handed him. The drought was an opportunity. He understood that as he crouched by the cut fence posts in the June heat. A rancher in financial trouble was a rancher with reduced options, and Crow would know as well as anyone what a dry summer did to a small operation. The fence wasn't about cattle. It was a message. He fixed the fence himself that afternoon. Didn't say anything in town, didn't go to the sheriff. Ridgeback's sheriff was a decent man named Purvis, who was generally fair, but who had limited appetite for range disputes between neighbors, and Caleb had no proof of anything yet beyond cut wood. He told Evelyn that night. She listened with her hand still in her lap, which he'd come to recognize as the posture of someone controlling their reaction very deliberately. "He wants the land," she said. "Always has. And the drought makes us vulnerable." "Yes." She was quiet. Then, "What kind of man is he?" Caleb thought about how to answer that honestly. The kind who gets what he wants and considers that proof that he deserves it. "Has he ever gotten physical with anyone?" "Not that I know of directly." He paused. His reputation with hired hands isn't good, but he's smart enough to keep his hands clean. She looked at him. So he'll keep using other methods. Until it stops working or we're gone, he said. Over the following 3 weeks, it escalated in increments. A section of water pipe on the west boundary was found blocked with debris, rocks wedged in too precisely to be natural. 2 of Caleb's steers turned up on Crow's land, the fence between them mysteriously open again, and getting them back involved a conversation with Crow's foreman that left Caleb's jaw tight for the rest of the day. In town, Caleb started hearing things that had Crow's fingerprints on them. Talk about the Thornton Ranch struggling, about whether the family could really hold on, about what a shame it would be if they had to sell. The rumors had evolved from personal, the nature of the marriage, the outsider widow, to financial. Someone, and Caleb had a clear idea who, was building a narrative about failure. He handled the fence repairs and the water pipe and the steer retrieval without saying much to the children, but the ranch was small and tension doesn't hide well in small spaces. Noah picked up on it and said nothing, which was its own signal. He'd learned to read Caleb's silences well enough to know when to leave them alone. Lucy picked up on it differently, the way younger children do, not with comprehension but with the animal sensitivity to atmosphere, becoming slightly clingier, slightly louder at meals, asking questions that circled without landing. The afternoon that changed things began ordinarily enough. Evelyn had sent Lucy to collect the eggs from the henhouse, which was a daily task Lucy had claimed as her own, with the proprietary pleasure of a child who has been trusted with real responsibility. The henhouse was 60 yards from the cabin, near the south fence. It was a Tuesday in late June, hot and still the way drought days get, the light too bright, the air carrying dust, the whole landscape looking slightly bleached. Caleb was in the barn. Noah was with him, working on a harness repair. Evelyn was inside. They heard it at the same moment, a horse, moving fast, and then the sound of the south gate being hit hard, and then Lucy's voice, high and sudden. Caleb was out of the barn in 4 seconds. Noah was right behind him. What he saw: 2 riders from Crow's outfit, one of whom he recognized as a man called Denny, who ran errands for Crow and had the look of someone who'd been given a little authority and no wisdom to go with it. The other was younger, somebody hired recent. They'd come through the south gate, his property, and the horses were moving in a way that was aggressive or careless, which in practical terms amounted to the same thing. Lucy had been coming back from the henhouse and was standing in the middle of the yard, the egg basket dropped at her feet, staring up at a horse that had come too close and been pulled up short only at the last moment. She wasn't under the horse, she was on the ground. She'd fallen going backward to get away from it. That was what Caleb saw. Lucy on the ground, eggs broken around her, and Denny on his horse looking down at her with an expression that was somewhere between startled and unconcerned. Caleb crossed the yard in a controlled walk that was not as controlled as it looked. He crouched by Lucy first. She was winded, scraped on the palms where she'd caught herself, one knee bleeding through her dress, but not broken, not seriously hurt, frightened more than anything. "I'm okay," she said, with the particular defiant instinct of someone who is mostly okay and wants you to stop looking at her. He checked her anyway. Scraped palms, cut knee, nothing worse. He looked up at her face. Her chin was steady even though her eyes were bright. "You're all right," he said quietly. "Stay here." He stood up and turned to face Denny. "We were just passing through," Denny said, already with a defensive edge that meant he'd registered the quality of what was coming toward him. "Didn't know the kid was there." "This is private land," Caleb said. His voice was even. He'd learned early that the cold version of himself was more effective than the hot version, and this was the cold version, completely. "You came through a closed gate." "Gate wasn't closed when we—" "It was closed," Noah said from 5 feet away. His voice was flat and certain. Denny looked at Noah with the specific contempt a grown man sometimes shows a boy who's said something inconvenient. "Son, you weren't even—" "Don't," Caleb said. One word. Something in the flatness of it stopped Denny mid-sentence. Evelyn had come out of the cabin. She crossed to Lucy, put herself between the girl and the horses without making a production of it, one hand on Lucy's shoulder. "You tell Crow," Caleb said, looking up at Denny, "that this is the last time anyone from his operation sets foot on my land without invitation. The next time it happens, I won't have this conversation. I'll go straight to Sheriff Purvis and I'll have names to give him. He paused. Your name. Denny's face went through several things. He was calculating, Caleb could see it, whether Crow's backing was enough protection to push back on this, and arriving at the conclusion correctly that it wasn't, not here, not with an injured child on the ground and witnesses. We'll leave, Denny said. Yes, Caleb agreed. You will. They left. Caleb watched them through the gate and then walked back and latched it hard. He crouched by Lucy again. The knee was still bleeding, not badly, but enough. He pulled the old cloth from his back pocket, which was not a proper bandage, but was what he had, and pressed it to the cut. She let him without complaining, which meant she was more shaken than she'd admitted. That horse nearly stepped on me, she said. Her voice was very careful. I know. I dropped the eggs. The eggs don't matter. She looked at him. Her face was working very hard at something. I wasn't scared, she said, in the voice of someone who had been quite scared. I was, he said. She blinked. He hadn't meant to say it, and he didn't take it back. You were? She asked. Yeah, he said simply. You're a kid on my property, and a horse came at you. Of course I was scared. She stared at him for another moment, and something in her face settled. That specific settling that happens when a child receives something they needed without knowing they needed it. Noah was standing nearby, quiet, watching. Caleb stood up and met his eyes, and something passed between them. Not words, just the acknowledgement of what had just happened, and what it meant, and what was probably coming next. Evelyn was looking at Caleb over Lucy's head. Her expression was not the one he expected. Not afraid, not upset. It was the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they'd been thinking. Inside, she said to Lucy, let me clean that knee properly. She led the girl toward the cabin, and as she passed Caleb, she said quietly, only for him, this isn't going to stop. No, he said. Then what do we do? He looked out at the gate, at the dust the riders had left. The land beyond it was dry and pale and enormous, and somewhere across it Silas Crow was in a house considerably larger than his, waiting with a patience that came from believing the outcome was already decided. We don't leave, Caleb said. It wasn't a complicated answer. It wasn't a strategy or a plan. It was simply the thing that was true, the one thing under everything, the floor beneath all the other considerations. He turned and went inside. That evening, after supper, after the children were in the loft, Lucy with her knee bandaged and a rare complaint about the unfairness of the situation that nobody argued with, Caleb sat at the table and did the math. He'd been avoiding doing the full math for weeks, and now he laid it out in pencil on the back of an old supply list. The hay costs if the drought continued, the cattle he'd need to sell early and at reduced price because starving cattle don't command good money, the fence repair costs that kept coming, the water situation. He added it all and stared at the bottom number for a long time. It wasn't ruin, not yet. But the margin between where they were and ruin was thinner than he'd let himself acknowledge, and he sat with that in the hot quiet of the cabin, feeling the specific loneliness of being the person who has to hold this knowledge. Evelyn sat down across from him. He hadn't heard her come down from wherever she'd been. She looked at the paper. He didn't cover it. She studied it for a moment. He watched her face go through the numbers. She was fast, he'd learned, faster than him at certain kinds of arithmetic, and then come out the other side with the same flat acknowledgement she brought to every hard fact. We need rain in July, she said. We need a lot of things in July. A pause. She folded her hands on the table. Caleb? He looked at her. I need you to hear me say something. All right. I'm not going to tell you I'm sorry I came here, she said. I know this is harder because of us. More mouths, more water, more everything. And now this business with Crow, I know that. She held his eyes. But I'm also not going to pretend I came here by accident. I made a choice. My children made a choice, whether they fully understood it or not. And choices have to be worth standing behind, or they were never really choices. He was quiet, watching her. So I'm not leaving, she said. That's what I need you to hear. Whatever Crow does, whatever the drought does, whatever the town says, I made a decision and I'm standing in it. You need to know that because... She paused, and for a moment something moved in her face that was less composed than her usual expression, a crack in the practical surface that revealed something raw underneath. Because I think you might still be waiting for us to go. Like we're something temporary you're managing until the real situation reasserts itself. He said nothing. She was not entirely wrong, which was uncomfortable in the way that accurate things often are. We're not temporary, she said. I need you to stop managing us like we are. He looked at his hands, at the numbers on the paper, at the kerosene lamp throwing its particular orange light across the table between them. I don't know how to do this, he said. It cost him something to say it. Neither do I, she said, but that doesn't mean we stop. He looked up. She was watching him with the same clear, assessing eyes she'd had stepping off that stage in December, the same eyes that had catalogued and decided and kept moving forward. But there was something else in them now that hadn't been there in December, something that had built up through months of shared difficulty. Not love, not yet, he didn't think, but something in the direction of it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just for a moment, clumsy and deliberate and awkward the way real gestures are. She didn't pull back. Then he took his hand away and picked up the pencil, and they went back to the numbers, going through every line item together, looking for what could be cut, what could be stretched, what might still save them if July cooperated, and luck decided to change its mind about the Thornton Ranch. Outside, the land was dark and dry and enormous. Somewhere across it, Silas Crow sat in his large house. Somewhere above the roof of the small cabin, stars were coming out over Montana in their millions, indifferent and ancient, watching a man and a woman work a pencil over a page by lamplight, neither of them willing to be the one who stopped. July did not cooperate. It came in hot and stayed that way, a hard, relentless heat that pressed down on the valley like something with intent. The creek dropped another 8 inches. The south pasture went from thin and yellow to thin and brown. Caleb sold 14 head of cattle at a price that made him set his jaw and say nothing when the buyer named it, because arguing would have changed nothing except the amount of time he spent standing in a hot field feeling bad about the number. He came home that evening with the money in his pocket and the weight of what it represented, both what it was and what it wasn't, and sat on the porch in the cooling dusk without going inside. After a while, Evelyn came out and sat on the step beside him. Not too close, not too far. How much? She asked. He told her. She absorbed it. It's not enough to cover the bank payment in September. No, but it buys us time. Some. She was quiet, looking out at the land. In the fading light, the ranch had a particular beauty that Caleb had always found almost aggravating. The way it looked soft and possible in the evenings when the day's harsh reality was obscured by golden light, like the land was pretending to be something easier than it was. We'll figure out September when we get to September, she said. That's not a plan. No, she agreed, but it's what we have right now. So, he almost said something about Crow. There had been 2 more incidents since the afternoon with Lucy. A water trough on the east boundary, mysteriously staved in, and a week later 3 of his horses found outside the paddock in the early morning, the gate open in a way that no wind accounted for. Each time he'd fixed what was broken and filed it away and said nothing to Sheriff Purvis because he still had no proof that would hold up to scrutiny, only the accumulating weight of coincidence that wasn't. He didn't say anything about Crow that evening. He sat with Evelyn until the light was fully gone and the stars came out, and then they went inside and went about the business of preparing for another day. August arrived, and with it the rain that should have come in July. But it didn't come the way rain is supposed to come, measured, gradual, the kind that soaks in instead of running off. It came the way things that have been held back too long come, all at once, with no manners about it. The first signal was the sky on a Tuesday morning in the second week of August. Caleb stepped outside at 4:30 and looked north and felt his stomach drop. The cloud system moving in from the mountains was not a summer shower. It was the kind of sky that makes experienced ranchers move livestock immediately and check every drain and worry about anything that could be picked up and carried. He went back inside. Get up, he said, loudly enough to reach the loft. Everyone. Noah was down the ladder in under a minute, which told Caleb the boy had also looked outside. Evelyn was already dressed. She'd heard his voice and registered the tone of it. Lucy came down slower, sleep-rumpled and confused, looking between the adults for information about how worried to be. Storm coming, Caleb said. Big one. Noah, you're with me. Evelyn, I need you to move everything from the barn floor to the high shelves, feed sacks, tools, anything that can't get wet or heavy. Lucy, he looked at her, calculating. You help your mother. Stay close to the cabin. You don't go past the fence line for any reason. You understand me? Lucy, reading his face with the accuracy she'd developed over 8 months of careful study, nodded without the usual questions. They moved. The wind hit at around 7 in the morning, an hour before the rain came, which gave them exactly enough time to get the cattle shifted to the high pasture and the horses into the barn and most of the movable equipment secured before the sky opened. When it opened, it was comprehensive. The rain came in sheets, nearly horizontal, driven by a wind that made the cabin walls shudder and turned the yard into a moving surface of water within 20 minutes. Caleb and Noah were still outside when it hit properly, wrestling a section of barn roof that had begun to peel back under the wind. The rain was cold and the wind was loud, and communication required shouting. Noah was on a ladder, something Caleb had tried to prevent and failed to, because the second pair of hands was genuinely necessary, and the boy had climbed the ladder before Caleb could get a sentence out. "Hold that edge," Caleb shouted over the wind. Noah pressed the roofing plank back against its frame with both hands, his weight against it, rain pouring off him. "It's not going to hold without another nail." "I know, I've got it." He was reaching for the nail when the gust came, sudden, significantly harder than what had come before, a concentrated burst that hit the barn broadside and tore the section out of both their grips. The plank swung wide, and Caleb went for it and caught the edge and felt his shoulder wrench with the weight of it, the specific tearing sensation of a joint taking force it wasn't designed for. He held on. He got the plank back and drove the nail one-handed while Noah held the piece in place. And when it was done, he stood in the rain breathing carefully, his right shoulder broadcasting its dissatisfaction in clear terms. "You're hurt," Noah said, flat, not asking. "It's fine. Your arm is—" "I know." He flexed it carefully. Not dislocated. He'd had that once, and this was different. A muscle pull or something in the joint, painful but functional. For now. "Keep moving." They got the barn closed. Coming back across the yard was its own challenge. The water was moving fast across the flat ground, already ankle-deep in places where the drainage couldn't keep up, carrying straw and loose debris. The rain had gone from heavy to something beyond heavy, the kind that makes you question the structural commitment of the sky. Inside, Evelyn looked at Caleb's arm the moment he came through the door. She crossed to him immediately, pushing his wet coat off his shoulder before he could object. "Don't," he started. "Quiet." She pressed carefully along his shoulder, watching his face for information he was trying not to give. He gave it anyway. A sharp intake at a specific point that he couldn't control. "You've pulled something in the joint," she said. "Maybe more. You need to not use it." "That's not—" "Caleb." Her voice had the specific quality it got when she'd already decided something. "You cannot fix a flood with one arm, which means you need to tell me and Noah what needs doing and let us do it." He looked at her. Water was dripping from his hair onto the floor. Outside the walls, the wind was doing something that sounded structural. "The east drainage ditch," he said, after a moment. "If it blocks, the water comes toward the foundation. I cleared it in spring, but if debris from the storm gets in there—" "I can do that," Noah said from behind Evelyn. He'd stripped his wet outer layer and was standing with the steady, ready quality he'd developed over months of ranch work. Not eager, not reckless, just present and prepared. Caleb looked at him. 12 years old. 12. He thought about the drainage ditch in these conditions, the water moving fast, the ground treacherous. "You go with him," he said to Evelyn. "I was already going," she said. "I'll watch Lucy," Lucy said from the table, which made absolutely no sense grammatically, but communicated her intention clearly. "You stay inside and away from the windows," Caleb told her. "I mean it." "I know," she said, with a patience that suggested she found his concern both touching and slightly insulting. Evelyn and Noah went out into the storm with tools and a rope that Evelyn had the foresight to grab from the hook by the door. Caleb stood at the window watching them move across the yard, bent into the wind, deliberate, Evelyn's hand on Noah's shoulder at a particularly rough gust, and felt something he couldn't entirely name, which was the specific helplessness of a man who is used to being the one in the middle of things, finding himself on the outside of them. Lucy came and stood beside him without asking permission. She watched her mother and brother disappear around the corner of the barn. "They'll be okay," she said. Not to comfort him exactly, or maybe exactly to comfort him. Hard to tell with Lucy. Yeah, he said. Mom's not scared of much, she said. She cried after Dad died, but she didn't stop doing anything. She just cried and kept going. He looked down at her. I think she's brave, Lucy said simply. Not the kind in stories, just the regular kind. He looked back out the window. Yeah, he said. Me too. The drainage ditch took 40 minutes. He watched from the window and paced the cabin and checked on the horses through the back door once when the wind briefly eased. And when Evelyn and Noah came back in soaked through and breathing hard, Noah holding one hand that had been cut by debris but not badly, Caleb felt a loosening in his chest that he'd been holding tight since they left. Done, Evelyn said, pulling off her coat. It was blocked about halfway up. We cleared about 30 pounds of junk out of it. She looked at her son. He figured out the best angle to work from without me telling him. Noah said nothing, but something in his face said he'd heard her. Caleb checked the cut on Noah's hand. Not deep, not worth real concern, needing only cleaning and wrapping. He cleaned it himself, which required using his bad shoulder in a way that made his teeth clench, and Noah noticed and said nothing, which was its own gesture. The storm peaked in the early afternoon, and what it did to the ranch in those 3 hours was significant. The henhouse roof partially collapsed under a falling tree branch. The hens survived, which Lucy greeted with a relief that was clearly about more than the eggs. The north section of the main pasture fence, old and already stressed from the drought, went down in a 60-foot section. Water got into the feed storage despite their efforts and ruined a portion of the remaining hay that they could not afford to lose. The wagon took damage from a second falling branch. The wheel assembly was intact, but the sideboard was split. They assessed it together in the brief quiet after the worst had passed, the four of them walking the property in the gray, dripping aftermath. Caleb's shoulder had stiffened into something that made every movement a considered decision. He made the inventory methodically, the way he always did, cataloging damage in order of urgency. Evelyn walked beside him, listening and noting. Noah was ahead of them, already at the fence line, studying the break with his hands on his hips, in a posture that reminded Caleb so strongly of himself at that age. Of the boy he'd been, working Felix Harker's land, learning to look at broken things and figure them out, that it stopped him for a moment. He stood in the wet grass and watched Noah examining that fence and felt something settle in him like load-bearing timber finding its footing. Caleb, Evelyn was looking at him. I'm here, he said. She studied his face. Whatever she saw, she let it go without comment. They kept walking. It was on the second loop of the property, when they were coming back past the south boundary, that they saw the smoke. It was coming from the direction of the Crow property. A thick, dark column, wrong against the washed, clean sky. Caleb stopped. Noah had seen it too, coming to stand beside him. That's his place, Noah said. Southeast barn by the look of it. Caleb watched the smoke. A barn fire after a lightning storm was not unusual. It was one of the things you dreaded, the combination of electrical strike and dry hay. Lightning hit something. Should we? Noah started. It's his land, Caleb said. Nobody said anything for a moment. The smoke kept rising. It's a person's barn, Evelyn said quietly. She wasn't pushing. She was stating a fact and leaving it with him. He stood with it. The history between him and Silas Crow was real and had sharp edges, and some of those edges had cut his children. That was also real. But the smoke was real too, and the question of what kind of man you were when the person you had reasons to dislike was in trouble. That was a question Caleb had been answering his whole life in the way he acted, not in the way he thought about himself. He looked at Noah. Stay with your mother and Lucy. Then to Evelyn, I'll be back. She met his eyes, said nothing, which he understood to mean she'd already reached the same conclusion and was simply waiting for him to catch up. He took the horse and rode the 3 miles to Crow's southeast barn and found it fully involved in 3 of Crow's hands working a bucket line that wasn't going to be enough. He rode in without announcement and joined the line, working with his bad shoulder in a way that he'd be paying for tomorrow, but which he put out of his mind, and they got the fire down in 40 minutes. Not saved, the barn was gone, but contained before it reached the adjacent structure. Crow was there. He'd come out from the main house at some point during the effort and was standing at the edge of the scene when Caleb finally stepped back from the line. They stood 20 feet apart, both of them wet and smoke-smelling, and Crow looked at him with an expression Caleb had never seen on the man's face before. It was not gratitude exactly, it was something more complicated than that. The expression of a man who has been forcing a particular narrative about someone else and has just had that narrative inconvenienced by evidence. "Thornton," Crow said. "Crow." A pause. The smoke was still rising from the collapsed barn, thinner now, the acrid smell of it everywhere. "You didn't have to come," Crow said. His voice was flat, but not in the aggressive way it usually was when Caleb encountered him. Just flat. "No," Caleb said. Another pause. "The storm take anything on your place?" "Some fence, roof damage, hay stores." He said it straight, without emphasis, not making it into an accusation, though both of them were aware that Crow's interference over the summer had complicated everything the storm made worse. Crow looked at the ruined barn. Something moved through his face. It might have been something recognizable as conscience, or it might have just been the particular blankness of a man looking at something he'd lost and recalculating what he thought he knew. "I lost my foreman tonight," he said suddenly. "Wylan. He was trying to move the horses when the roof went. They got him out, but the doctor doesn't—" He stopped. Caleb was quiet. Wylan. He'd dealt with Wylan twice over the years. Not a man he'd liked particularly, but a real person, with a family somewhere. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it without qualification. Crow looked at him. The calculation was happening behind his eyes. Caleb could see it, the man working out what Caleb's presence here meant, what it said about the story Crow had been telling himself. It was not a comfortable calculation by the look of it. "The water pipe on your west boundary," Crow said. His voice had changed. Something had dropped out of it, some layer of managed ease. "And the fence posts, that was Denny acting outside what I told him to do." A pause. "I didn't order him to touch the girl." Caleb held very still. It was as close to an admission as a man like Crow would come, and both of them knew it. "Denny's gone," Crow added. "I sent him on last week." "Good," Caleb said, without heat, just the fact of it. Crow looked at the barn again. He was old, Caleb thought. Older than he'd seen before, the fire and the loss of the evening having stripped some of the hardness off his face and left something more human. Not sympathetic, just human. "Your fence line that went down in the storm," he said. "The north section." "I know it. I'll send men to help repair it." Caleb looked at him steadily. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity." Crow's jaw was tight. "It's, call it what you want." A long moment. The last of the smoke drifted between them. "All right," Caleb said. "Send them Wednesday." He rode home through the wet dark, his shoulder burning, the horse moving carefully on the muddy road. He arrived back to find the cabin lit warm against the night, and when he came through the door, all three of them were still up. Evelyn at the table with the supply ledger, Noah sharpening a blade by the fire, Lucy asleep in her chair with her head on her arm, which meant she'd been determined to stay awake and lost the argument. Evelyn looked at him when he came in, at the smoke smell and the mud and the way he was holding his shoulder. "How bad is it over there?" "Lost a barn, lost—" "Crow's foreman is bad. The man who was running the horses when the roof went." She absorbed that. "And Crow?" Caleb sat down carefully, the relief of it moving through his legs. "He said the damage to our property was his man acting beyond instruction. Offered to send help with the north fence." Evelyn was quiet, watching him. Noah had looked up from the blade, listening. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "About the instruction?" "I believe he's a man who'd given instruction without giving an instruction," Caleb said. "Whether Denny knew exactly where the line was, probably not. But Crow set the conditions for it." He paused. "He knows that." "But you're going to let him send the men." "The fence needs fixing," he said, "and there are things worth being right about and things worth getting done. Those aren't always the same things." She looked at him for a moment longer with that look she had, the one that was still sometimes hard to read, the one that had more behind it than she usually put into words. Then she got up, went to the stove, and came back with a hot cloth. She pressed it to his shoulder without asking, and he let her sitting still under her hands, and it was the particular intimacy of that, a practical gesture, nothing romanticized, just care extended person to person, that landed somewhere deep. Noah set the blade down. I'll take first watch on the cattle tonight, he said. Your shoulder needs rest. Caleb looked at him. At the 12-year-old boy who had spent the day doing things that grown men had done beside him, who had cleared a drainage ditch in a violent storm, who was now calmly volunteering for night watch because it needed doing, and he could see that. 2 hours, Caleb said. Then you wake me. 3, Noah said. Then I wake you. They looked at each other. 2.5, Caleb said. Noah almost smiled. Fine. He went out. Evelyn was still working on Caleb's shoulder, gently, finding the worst of the tightness and pressing against it with the methodical patience of someone who'd done this before. Lucy was asleep with the wholehearted commitment of children, her breathing soft and regular, one hand curled under her chin. We held together today, Evelyn said quietly. Not triumphant, not relieved exactly, just noting a fact. Yes, he said, all 4 of us. He looked at Lucy sleeping. At the door Noah had gone out through. He felt Evelyn's hands on his shoulder and the warmth of the cabin and the evidence of a day they'd gotten through together. Damaged, imperfect, costly in ways they'd still be accounting for, but through. All 4 of us, he said. She finished with his shoulder and stepped back. He reached up with his good hand and caught hers for just a moment before she moved away. Not a hold, just a pause, a second of contact, thumb across her knuckles. She let him hold it for that second. Then she went back to the ledger and he sat by the fire and watched the embers and let the long day settle into his bones. And outside, the clean, storm-washed Montana sky was filling with stars in numbers that made individual troubles feel small against the scale of everything, even when those troubles were real, even when they cost real things. He sat with that for a while. Not at peace, not resolved, the bank payment still coming, and the hay stores still damaged, and Crow still a problem, probably, in whatever evolved form that problem would take. But here, all 4 of them, here. That was not nothing. That was in fact the only thing that mattered. The north fence got fixed on Wednesday, same as Caleb said. Crow sent 4 men with tools and lumber, and they worked alongside Noah and Caleb through the morning without much conversation, the way men who are working out a complicated history through shared labor tend to do, with their hands instead of their mouths. By noon, the fence line was solid again, better than before the storm, and Crow's men left without ceremony, and Caleb watched them go and didn't feel grateful exactly, but felt something that was in the neighborhood of the ledger being slightly less uneven than it had been. The bank payment was due September 15th. That number sat on the kitchen table in pencil, on the same piece of paper Caleb and Evelyn had worked over in late June, and it didn't get any smaller no matter how many times either of them looked at it. After the storm damage, after the early cattle sale, after the hay losses, they were short by an amount that wasn't catastrophic in a long horizon sense, but was completely impassable in the immediate sense of September 15th being a fixed point in time that didn't care about long horizons. Caleb had ridden to Ridgeback to speak with the bank manager, a man named Forsyth who had the pleasant bedside manner of someone who delivered bad news professionally and had learned to keep his own face out of it. Forsyth explained that the bank had been flexible with the Thornton account twice previously, and that flexibility had limits, and that he was sorry about the drought and the storm damage because he genuinely was, in the way that a man behind a desk can be sorry about things happening to other men in fields, and that the payment was due on the 15th. Caleb rode home and told Evelyn the conversation without editing it. She sat with it quietly, and then said, "How much more do we need?" He told her. She thought. "If we sold the 2 mares, those are working horses," he said. "We sell them, we lose the capacity we need for next season. We'd be buying them back at worse prices." "The sewing machine," she said. He looked at her. Her sewing machine was one of 2 things she'd brought from St. Louis that was not purely practical. The other was a small wooden box of James Carter's things she kept on the shelf in the curtained corner. The sewing machine was how she'd earned money before, how she'd kept the children fed after James died. Selling it wasn't just losing a machine. "No," he said. "Caleb, no," he said again, not harshly. "That's not where we are yet." Where they were, after that conversation, was a place of particular quiet. Not the hostile kind, the kind that settles over a house when the people in it have exhausted the options they can see and are waiting to find out if there are options they haven't seen yet. It was Lucy who told them something was happening in town 2 weeks before the 15th. She'd gone to Ridgeback with Evelyn for supplies and had spent the trip back in an unusual silence that Evelyn had noted but not pushed on. That evening at supper, Lucy put down her fork and said very deliberately, "There were people talking in the store today. About us?" Caleb looked at her. What kind of talking? Not the bad kind. She seemed genuinely puzzled by this, as though she'd been trained by experience to expect the other variety. "Mrs. Hurst was talking to the woman from the post office, and I heard her say something about the Thornton place and the storm damage and the bank, and she wasn't saying it mean." Lucy frowned, working through it. She sounded worried, like actually worried. Evelyn and Caleb exchanged a glance. "Did you hear anything specific?" Evelyn asked. "She said something about whether anyone had done anything, like done anything to help." Lucy picked her fork back up. "I don't know. It was strange." Caleb thought about that conversation through the evening and set it aside as something he couldn't act on or interpret without more information, which was the only sensible thing to do with it. He had enough real problems without constructing theories about conversations he hadn't been present for. The wagon came on a Saturday morning, 10 days before the 15th. He was out at the barn when he heard it. More than one wagon, by the sound of wheels on the dry road. And he came around the corner of the barn to look, and stopped. There were 7 wagons. 7. Coming down the road from Ridgeback in a loose procession that raised dust in the morning light. He stood and watched them come, not entirely sure what he was looking at, and then Evelyn came out of the cabin to see what had stopped him and stood beside him, and they both watched the wagons come on. He recognized faces as they pulled in. Aldred Hutchins, who had married them 8 months ago, driving the first wagon. The Pryor family from the north end of the valley. May and Gordon Sellers, who ran the feed supply. A farmer named Ames, whom Caleb had helped years ago with a broken irrigation pipe and hadn't spoken to since. Tom Birch, who had 2 boys Noah's age and a large operation east of town, several others. People he knew to varying degrees, some well, some barely. And in the last wagon, alone, Silas Crow. Aldred Hutchins climbed down from his wagon and crossed to where Caleb was standing. He was a man who moved efficiently and spoke efficiently, and today was no different. He held out an envelope. Caleb looked at it without taking it. "What is this?" he said. Not a question exactly. "Open it," Hutchins said. He opened it. Inside was a folded paper and money, cash and a bank draft. Various denominations from various pockets, clearly collected from multiple sources. The number written on the paper was close to what he needed, closer than anything he'd been able to put together himself. He looked up. The people who'd come stood in his yard in the morning light, looking back at him with the slightly awkward quality of people who have done something generous and are not sure how it's going to be received. Mabel Hurst was there, he realized. Mabel Hurst, who had called Evelyn a poor dear in her store and meant it as condescension. She was standing near the back, not making herself prominent. Caleb looked at Hutchins. "Why?" he said. One word. Hutchins cleared his throat. "Several reasons. Most of them are standing here and can give you their own." He paused. "The storm hit everyone this summer. But you got the drought and Crow's interference, and you didn't sell and you didn't leave, and you came and helped with that barn fire even after everything. That's the kind of neighbor people notice, Thornton, even when they've been slow about it." Caleb said nothing. His jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Evelyn was standing beside him, and she was very still in the way she got when something was moving through her that she was not going to let out in public. He could feel it without looking at her. Noah came out of the barn behind them, took in the scene, and went very quiet in the way he did when he understood something large was happening and was working out what it meant. Lucy pushed through from behind her mother and looked at the wagons and the people and said, "Why is everyone here?" in the clear, caring voice she used for all questions regardless of context. "They came to help," Evelyn told her, her voice slightly rougher than usual. Lucy looked at the envelope in Caleb's hand. She looked at the people. She looked back at her mother's face, reading it with the precision she'd applied to adult faces since she was old enough to understand that adult faces contained information that adult words sometimes left out. She went over to Mabel Hurst, who was standing near the back, and said, "Thank you for coming," with the grave politeness of someone who has made a specific decision to put something behind them and is acting on it directly. Mabel Hurst looked down at Lucy, and something moved in her face that was probably as close to genuine embarrassment as the woman had ever gotten. "Of course, dear," she said, and this time it didn't have the edges it used to. Caleb watched his 7-year-old teach a lesson he'd have struggled to deliver himself. He looked down at the envelope again. Crow was still in his wagon. He hadn't come down. Caleb walked over to him, the envelope in his hand, and looked up. Crow looked old in the morning light. The barn fire and Wyland's death, which Caleb had heard had in fact been a death, and not just a bad injury, had taken something out of him. He was not soft. Men like Crow don't go soft. But he was different, reduced, in a way that was less about size and more about the specific deflation that happens when someone realizes the story they've been telling about themselves has a significant flaw in it. "You didn't have to come," Caleb said. His voice was even. "I know," Crow said. A pause. Somewhere behind them, people were starting to unload wagons. Food, Caleb realized. They'd brought food as well as money, and someone had a fence post that suggested this was going to turn into a work day as much as anything else. "I want to buy your land," Crow said. "I still want that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Caleb looked at him. "All right, but I'm not going to try to take it from you." He said it like a man who's written something down and is reading it aloud to make it real. It won't happen again." Caleb thought about the cut fence posts and the blocked water pipe, and the afternoon Lucy ended up on the ground. He thought about the envelope in his hand and Wyland and the burned barn, and Crow sitting alone in his last wagon because he'd done enough damage that showing up at all required a particular kind of willingness to be uncomfortable. "This land's not for sale," Caleb said, "but I'll tell you straight, the water situation on the east boundary has been a problem for both of us. If you want to talk about shared access to the creek bottom, I'm willing to have that conversation." Crow looked at him for a long moment. The calculation that ran behind the man's eyes was real. Caleb could always see it there. But this time what came out of it was different. "Wednesday," Crow said. "I'll come Wednesday." "Come for supper," Caleb said. He surprised himself saying it and then decided it was correct. You didn't negotiate well with a man you'd only met standing up in a yard. "Bring whatever you need to draw on." Crow's expression went through something. "All right," he said, and climbed down from the wagon. The morning became something Caleb hadn't expected and couldn't have planned. The people who'd come worked. They actually worked, not ceremonially but practically, moving through the ranch doing the things that needed doing. And Evelyn directed them with the clear organizational authority of someone who'd been running a household against hard odds for months and knew exactly what the priorities were. The remaining storm damage got addressed. The damaged hen house got properly rebuilt rather than the patch job Caleb had managed. 2 women Caleb barely knew were in his kitchen by mid-morning producing enough food for everyone present and more besides. He worked beside people he'd mostly kept at a distance for 12 years and found that keeping distance had been partly his own doing. Not entirely, the town had its share of the blame, but partly his. A man who spends long enough with just his horses and his fence line starts to lose the habit of other people. And losing the habit doesn't mean not needing them. Noah spent the morning with Tom Birch's 2 boys, and Caleb watched him from across the yard, watched him talk to them with the specific careful quality of someone not used to peers, feeling his way, and then gradually watched something ease in him, the stiffness of months of adult-only company releasing slightly as he found that boys his age were, in fact, his speed. Lucy organized the food distribution at midday with an authority that made several adults defer to her without quite knowing why, and Caleb caught Evelyn watching this and caught the look on her face, the complicated private pride of a mother watching her child be more than she could have predicted. He went and stood beside her. "We're going to make the payment," she said. "Yes. And next year will be better, or it'll be hard in new ways." "Probably both," he said. She looked at the yard full of people, at the work being done, at Lucy pointing a woman twice her size toward the correct table. "I owe some people an apology," she said. "Specifically, Mrs. Hurst. Partly." "Partly?" "Some of what I said to her in January was warranted," she said. "The delivery may be less so." He almost smiled. "The delivery seemed fine to me." She glanced at him. "You didn't see your face when I said it." "What was wrong with my face?" "Nothing was wrong with it," she said, and left it there in the particular way she had of leaving things that were actually compliments without quite finishing them. He let it sit. The afternoon light was doing its thing to the land, that golden late summer quality that made 700 acres look like something worth every difficult thing it had cost, every cold morning and broken fence and bad number in pencil on old paper. He'd looked at this land his whole adult life and had been right about it, he thought. Worth it. Worth all of it. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, standing on this same porch in the October dark, looking at land that belonged to him and nobody else, feeling that ownership as a weight rather than a gift. Alone in a way that had gone past preference into damage, though he wouldn't have used that word for it then. Writing a letter to a stranger in pencil because his pen had dried out, not sure he was doing the right thing, not sure of much except that he couldn't keep doing what he'd been doing. He'd been afraid, though he'd have denied it, afraid that he'd waited too long, that the years of alone had made him unsuitable for the company of other people, that he was the kind of man who could build a fence line and couldn't build anything else. He looked at Noah repairing a hinge with one of Birch's boys, talking as they worked, relaxed in a way he hadn't been in months. He looked at Lucy, who was now sitting with two other children Caleb didn't recognize, and showing them something in the dirt with a stick with the enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered the pleasure of an audience. And then Evelyn turned to him, not for any particular reason, just turned, and looked at him with the straightforward directness she'd had stepping off that stage and had never lost, and said, "This is good. Not effusive, not dramatic, just the plain, true thing." "Yeah," he said. She nodded once and went back to watching the yard, and he stood beside her and let the afternoon happen around him. The noise of it, the people, the work being done, the particular quality of a place where things are happening because people have decided to make them happen together. He reached for her hand. Not the brief gesture from the night of the storm. This was deliberate and unhurried, his rough fingers finding hers in the way of something that had been working up to this for 8 months of hard weather and shared difficulty, and the slow, careful building of something neither of them had set out to build but had built anyway. She looked down at their hands, then up at him. "About time," she said. He laughed, a real one, short and sudden. The kind he hadn't used in so long it surprised him coming out. She laughed too. And standing in his own yard on a Saturday afternoon in late summer with the mortgage money in the house and a full year of his life behind him that had broken him open and remade him in ways he was still understanding, Caleb Thornton held on to that laugh and onto her hand and let himself stand in the middle of his life without bracing against it for the first time in longer than he could account for. The payment got made on September 15th. Forsyth took the envelope and counted it and gave Caleb a receipt, and that was that. No fanfare, no speech. Caleb walked out of the bank into the September morning and sat in the wagon for a moment by himself before heading home. He'd spent the drive thinking about what it actually meant. Not the number, but the fact underneath the number. That he'd almost lost the thing he'd spent half his life building, and that what had kept it wasn't his stubbornness, though he'd had plenty of that, and wasn't his practicality, though that had helped. It was the people. The ones who'd come with wagons and lumber and cash from their own pockets in the tight year after a drought. Nobody does everything alone, is the thing. Men who think they do are either lying or counting wrong. Caleb had been counting wrong for 12 years, and he'd needed an envelope full of evidence to see it. The supper with Crow happened that Wednesday, and it was awkward in a way that was honest rather than hostile. Two men who had history sitting at a table and working out whether there was a future that didn't require ongoing damage to each other. The creek access conversation was real and practical, and resulted in an arrangement that wasn't perfect but was functional, which was about all you could ask for from arrangements between complicated men. Crow left before full dark. At the door he stopped and looked at the cabin, at the light in the window, at Lucy's drawing on the shelf visible through the glass. Still there. Still the 4 stick figures, though Lucy had added a 5th recently, a small figure she'd labeled the cat, even though they didn't have a cat. Yet, she'd said, when Caleb pointed this out. Yet, Crow looked at all of it for a moment, and then looked at Caleb with the complicated face of a man settling a complicated account. "You built something here," he said. "We built something," Caleb said, and the pronoun was exact and deliberate. Crow nodded once and went out to his horse and rode away into the dark. Caleb stood in the doorway watching him go. Behind him the cabin was warm and full of the sounds of an evening. Evelyn and Noah going over his schoolwork at the table, Lucy somewhere in the loft talking to herself the way she did, the wood stove ticking, the horses shifting in the barn, all the sounds of a life inhabited. A life that was nobody's idea of easy and had not gone the way anyone planned and had cost real things and would go on costing them because that's the nature of anything worth keeping. He went back inside. He closed the door behind him on the night and the dark and the enormous indifferent sky, and he sat down at the table next to his wife and across from his son and listened for the voice of his daughter above him and felt, in the plainest and most uncomplicated way, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because everything had worked out. Things had worked out roughly, partially, imperfectly, in the way real things do. But because the man who had sat at this table a year ago in the dark, listening to silence and looking at an empty chair, had finally understood something. It had taken him 38 years and one act of terrified hope to learn that the life you build alone is never quite enough. That the thing you're most afraid to need is usually exactly what you need. That family isn't a thing that happens to you. It's a thing you keep choosing, one ordinary difficult morning at a time, until one day you look up and realize the choosing has made something real. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold while he was standing in the doorway. He drank it anyway. Some things you take as they come.